So thank you, first of all, to Scott, Kurt, Melinda, to Kevin and Jeremy, who are handling all the technical, and of course to everyone who at some point in the future, which will be the now when this is seen, the way that works, is joining us. But I especially want to say thank you to Dr. Ashley Lucas for joining us today, as we have the deep honor and pleasure, I'm very excited to talk with you today, Ashley, about your new book. And so I would love for you to tell us the title. To me, it's kind of like naming a baby. So let's hear the title and yeah, and then we'll just go from there.
Well, I'm honored to be here, Karen. Thank you so much for having me. The title of the book is Prison Theater and the Global Crisis of Incarceration. And I have the book here with me today. I want to make sure people see it, not just because I think it's a really pretty book, but because the cover art was made by an incarcerated artist in the state of Michigan named Yoshikawa. And I'm so proud to have his artwork on the cover of this book. And he's got a beautiful spirit, and I think it shines through in the work.
Yeah, very beautiful. Thank you. And congratulations, because it was just, I thought I heard you say it had just sold out and gone into a second printing, and it was just recently released. So what were the dates around that? Date, weight, length? Let's get all the details.
The official release date was September 3rd, 2020. Today is September 25th. But by the time the book was actually released on September 3rd, the paperback had sold out in the US, much to my surprise and delight. I was not expecting that at all. And now people are a little bit slow to get their copies because it is being reprinted. So I think the second printing has happened and now it's shipping from overseas.
So I just want to tell folks listening in and watching this that I did an unusual thing of kind of trying to script out our interview a little bit, which was really a way to get my thoughts in order. But the truth is, I am going to go with the flow. And what I really want to ask you right now is, how does it feel? How does it feel? If I feel emotional, and I did not have this baby. So does it feel like this new thing in the world to you? Does it feel like a relief? Can you talk about how you feel?
It's a complicated thing because this book is very personal to me. So it is a work of theater history scholarship, but it's also part memoir, part travelogue, much performance analysis of things that are very close to my heart. I saw some incredible productions in prisons throughout the world. And to have it be in the world makes me both, not just both, and I have so many emotions. So I'm happy about it being out. I'm proud of it. It also scares me because I have lived in fear, especially in the last year of the 7 years that I was writing this book, that I could write something that would have a negative impact on a prison theater program somewhere, that someone in power, the overlords of some place, would look at this and say, oh, people in prison shouldn't be doing the thing that she describes, and that some fantastic program could suffer for that. So I tried to write carefully and really argue for the value of everything that was happening in prison. But especially with prisons, you just never know what kind of impact your work could have in the world. So one of the things that has moved me greatly and really surprised me is that I deliberately tried to send the book. I'm still in the process of sending the book to as many people in prison as possible, because I feel like I need to give it back to the people who gave it to me in letting me see all of this incredible performance work in prisons. And some of my good friends in Michigan prisons who we've worked with for a long time through the Prison Creative Arts Project have been receiving the book and reading it. And I talk about the fact that my father was incarcerated and that he passed away last November in 2019. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize that reading my book was going to be the way that some people in prison found out that I had lost my father, and that would be sort of part of the journey of the book. So that's been very emotional and a little overwhelming at the same time.
Yeah, and so honoring to him, I think, to his memory and your love for him and his for you. That really
Absolutely.
is such a profound thread through the book. Firstly, I love it because I can understand it. And what I mean by that is there is some very complicated writing around theatre in prison that I find difficult to access. I don't know if it's that I don't have the performance theory background, or I'm not sure what it is, but I have to say that I loved the rich detail. I loved that you're a storyteller. I loved that I felt like I was seeing and hearing the people you loved who lived in those prisons and made theatre there. And of course, when I got to the piece where you were writing about love and what it means to have that as the paradigm, it made sense to me because you write with such love. And so I want to go to asking you about what kind of was the origin of this particular book, because you do have another. You've done several journal articles, and I'm sure lots of other pieces of writing. I know your one-woman play, so it's not new to you writing, and yet something must have stirred up. And I'm wondering about what that was and what kind of, how it blossomed into this project.
This book feels like a culmination of a long journey for me. And I say this in the book also, that I didn't know that this book was part of my journey for a long time. But as I was writing it, it became very clear to me that so much else in my life had led up to this moment. So I'm honored that you found the book to be very readable and that the people in the book came alive to you, because as the child of an incarcerated father, I spent so much of my life. He went to prison when I was 15 and stayed for 20 years. And so that's this huge chunk of my life that is hard to explain to other people, because at events at school and places where a father is supposed to appear, I couldn't show people that I really had one. But my father was not dead, and he was not forgotten, and he was not unloved. Mm-hmm. And I wanted the other people in my life, and many people who were very important to me, and even people who were just a passing phase in my life, to know that I have a father, that I am proud of him, that we have a great love and bond between us, that I honor his life in the way that I live my life. And that's really, really hard to explain to people who can't meet the person you love in prison. Mm-hmm. And I realized when I started doing research on the families of the incarcerated and writing my own play about that was an experience that a lot of people shared. And so when I got to the point in my life much later where I was writing this book and I wanted to tell people about what it was like to see these theatrical productions, it was much a part of the same process that I started when I was 15 years old, learning to tell the stories of the people who can't be in the room today. And so one of the things I want to be really certain to say in this conversation is that I want to uplift all of those people who can't be a part of this conversation, who can't watch it on the internet because they are still serving time, or because they passed away without getting the chance to live in freedom. So I try to be a really good storyteller in the book because I want other people to feel the presence of all of these really smart, creative, amazing performers who are a part of this world of prison theater making throughout the entire world. It wasn't just in my own backyard here in Michigan, but in Australia, in South Africa, in all of these amazing places, there were people engaged in something really beautiful that not very many people get to see. And I carry that privilege in my heart that I'm one of the people who got to see all of this, and I want to share it with a larger audience.
Yeah. Do you feel that in the way that the arts can be cathartic or have a cathartic element for folks who are involved in them, do you feel there was something cathartic about this process for you, or would you not describe it that way?
I definitely think that my entire journey through this world of entering into the theater in prisons is very cathartic for me. I'm hesitant to speak for other people. I do think a lot of people find catharsis in doing the work. I also think a lot of people find something different, that they find it very challenging, that they find it an intellectual puzzle, that they find it a way. I make this argument in the book. They find it a way to get other things done that aren't about the theater. And often the catharsis is part of that. It happens along the way. I do think that's a very powerful aspect of prison theater for a great many people, but it's not always the primary driving force. And in my own life, the catharsis was in large part finding other people who understood, because the theater is a huge part of my life and prisons have been a huge part of my life. And until I discovered that there were people actually making theater in prison, which took a much longer time than one might expect for me to figure that out, I didn't realize that I had this tribe, this kindred community of people in many parts of the world. And one of the things that I'm most excited about the book is that there are a whole lot of people in prison now, or who've been through these programs in prison, who are out, who are going to have a chance to see how much this is happening in other places that they might not have been aware of. Because I think it makes us a part of a culture, a part of a global community that many of us didn't know we had.
Right. And I think, you know, the fact that you, as other authors have done, committed this extensive period of time, a lot of resources, energy. I mean, you went to, what was it, 10 different countries?
Yes.
12 states,
10.
and 16 symposiums or conferences. You know, and I'm curious to know, what were you looking for? Like, did you know what you were looking for? Or did you start to recognize it when you saw it? Or did it come later in the process than that?
My thinking evolved a lot over time. So in the beginning, I wanted to know what is happening with the phenomenon of prison theater. It's happening in so many places. And if you think about it for any length of time, it's totally bizarre that it's happening in so many places, because unlike creative writing or visual art that a lot of people can do individually in prison in isolation, the theater requires a public, it requires collaborators, it requires the prison to let you interact with other people. It often requires touch and shouting, and sometimes costumes or sets that might be built with dangerous tools. It requires a lot of things that prisons don't like to allow. And different versions of prison theater use different amounts of each one of those things. But it's a hard act to pull off. It is not a simple process. It is not a quiet undertaking to figure out how to make theater in prison. And yet it's happening in such incredible ways and in such volume around the world. And a lot of people still don't know about it because it's happening in these spaces that are closed off to everybody else. So I wanted to figure out what that was about. Why were people doing this incredibly hard thing so often in so many places across literally hundreds or thousands of years of world history? How did this happen? And then I thought, well, maybe I'll arrange the book in a kind of geographical way where I go through different countries to figure out how their national prison theater culture works. And then I realized very quickly that that didn't work at all, that there are a lot of things that the Prison Creative Arts Project, which is the program with which I work in Michigan, has in common with other improv-based programs in other parts of the world than it does with Shakespeare Behind Bars, which is just around the corner from us. So we have a lot in common with Shakespeare Behind Bars, which is also in Michigan prisons, but we in some ways have more in common with people in some other countries doing work that is structured more similarly to us. So then I thought, well, maybe I'm going to write about how you structure different kinds of prison theater, and I'll do a chapter on the Shakespeare people, and I'll do a chapter on devised theater. And then I realized that that kind of didn't add up either, because there were people doing Shakespeare who again had more in common with somebody who was doing some other type of theater than they had with the other Shakespeare people. And the more I saw, the more I traveled, the more I realized that what I was actually most interested in was finding out why incarcerated people find that the theater is a useful activity. Because I asked a lot of people in a lot of different places what their relationship to theater was prior to incarceration and what they hoped to get out of it. And the vast majority of people, with some really interesting notable exceptions, were not familiar with theater at all when they came to prison. And then they get involved in one of these programs. It becomes this huge part of their lives. And some people told me it was the thing that kept them from committing suicide, having the connection to this community and this life practice of making theater. But even at that, even when it was that high stakes, most of those people didn't intend to become theater makers professionally upon their release from prison. So this is not just a clear pathway to, I get some skills and I'm building a new life that's based on theater. So what the heck was it? And what I end up arguing in the book was that I saw, even if people couldn't quite articulate it to me in this way when I asked them, I saw that they were using theater as a strategy to accomplish other things. So the book is divided into chapters that look at theater as a strategy for making communities, theater as a strategy for developing professional skills, theater as a strategy for creating social change, which is really fascinating. And there is structural change that has happened in prisons because of theater. And finally, theater as a practice of hope to help keep people alive.
Yes. Yes. And as one guy described, so he could get out of bed in the morning, right? Like, there's a lot to be said for simply getting up each day and having a group of people who love you. I think that's really what, well, there's so many things that struck me, but that grabbed me by the heart. And that very first chapter where you talk about community making, culture making, family making, both the family of theater, as well as connections across to the outside, to one's own family, to Mama Sharon. I'm looking her up because I want to know her address, because I want to send her some money for postage, because I'm so moved by that. And the man who cut off his braid that could be married, it could be buried with Andrea Wiggins. I read the book, folks. You'll hear the story. Maybe, do you want to share just a little about that? I feel like that first chapter encompasses so much of your heart that I wonder, we have a reading, don't we, that we thought might be quite nice to do. I think it's on page 3 of our notes, and it's from chapter 1. It's number 8 there.
I have it.
Wonder if this would be a nice time to do that.
I think so. I mean, before I read, I'll just say that Mama Sharon, for people who haven't read the book, is an extraordinary woman. I went to a theater company in Oregon to visit this program called Open Hearts, Open Minds. And they were working in a prison in a place called Umatilla in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. We had to drive 3 hours out of Portland to get there. It's a men's prison called Two Rivers. And Open Hearts, Open Minds was doing a production of The Winter's Tale by William Shakespeare. And it was a remarkable production. It was a beautiful production, but I didn't know this yet. I'd never been in this prison before, never seen this company perform. And I sit down in the visiting room, which is converted into a theater, and there's this adorable pair of little old ladies sitting next to me. And I looked at the woman next to me, and she was wearing this really sparkly cardigan. And I said, "That is such a great sweater." And she said, "You know, I came here last year, and there were some people really dressed up, and I thought I better get with it this time around." And I just thought, she is the cutest thing that ever happened. And we saw this amazing play. The audience is incredibly moved. And when it's all over, the men on stage start thanking this woman who's seated next to me in the audience. And it turns out that she was the actual mother of one of the actors, but she's also adopted the entire theater company and sends them a ton of mail, and really has made them a genuine part of her family. And that mode of building families in a place where it's really hard to get one is one of the most beautiful things that I had seen. And it was all possible, not just because she had a son there, but because her son did this community building work of the theater. The theater was actually what made her brave enough to visit him, because just to go and see your loved one behind bars was such an intimidating concept that she had not been to see him until he was in a play. And then because of that play, immediately she was connected to everybody else. So Mama Sharon is the heart of the community building chapter, along with those glorious men who were in the play. And I'm going to read just one chapter from a section, or one paragraph from a section of the chapter called Prison Theater as an Act of Love. The concept that incarcerated people can love others and that others love them disrupts the very idea of the prison. Prisons by design hold the people we deliberately exile, the ones who cause harm, the people we do not want to contemplate. When we recognize those people in their full humanity as complex beings capable of love, not just sexual desire and objectification, but the myriad and subtle kinds of human solidarity and altruism that surround us every day, it becomes harder to say that these people deserve life and punishment only. Love encompasses and enables family relationships, friendships, the kindnesses we do one another on a daily basis, admiration and respect for people, and the things we cherish, the willingness to put others' needs above our own, and so much more. It should not be reduced to a singular or fixed reference or a set of sexual acts. If someone who did something terrible, or even many terrible things, can simultaneously be a loving person, then perhaps we should be cultivating the loving side of that person instead of reducing them to the worst thing they ever did and insisting that they are capable of nothing else.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Weight of Glory, talks about every day in our interactions with people, we're helping them to become glorious beings or hideous monsters. And I think that's a weighty thing, isn't it, to recognize. And in fact, what you write in chapter 4, which looks at your theatre as strategy for hope, you write, "It devastates me over and over again when I realize how few people outside prisons get to know the extraordinary people I have met inside the walls." And I want to ask you about that. That's a powerful word, devastates you over and over. How do you carry that sense? What does that mean? And how does that drive what you tried to do in the book and really what your work is?
Again, I think that understanding of the value of people we don't get to see most of the time comes very much from my relationship with my father, who I don't even have words for the love that I have from my father, who passed away just as I was finishing writing the book. I lived 20 years where I couldn't show him to anybody, where other people in my life who were very dear to me, my own husband had to meet my father in a prison visiting room, and it took us mailing our marriage certificate 3 times to the prison to have him allowed to be added to my father's visiting list. So the incredible work, the labor that you have to do to show people in prison in their full humanity to someone else is immense. And I know that in a deep way in my own life. And then I walk into prisons, and this is hard for people to understand if they haven't actually visited a prison. But if you come to a prison not as a staff person and not as an incarcerated person, but as someone who is visiting, either because you have a loved one inside or because you've come to do programming or even to observe a program like a performance of a play, the people inside the prison greet you with this intensity of welcome and love and respect. If I got the kind of respect that I receive in prisons, walking in for the first time to a prison where nobody knows me and people don't even know why I'm there, I receive this incredible respect. Whereas if I walk into a government office or across my own campus or in an airport or, God forbid, the Department of Motor Vehicles, you are not treated with this level of recognition of your humanity and excitement that you exist, whoever you are. When you walk into prison and you are a person in street clothes who has a smile on their face and is looking to be kind to people, if you're excited to see the folks inside, they are going to give you every bit of their attention and emotional energy. Nobody is on a cell phone. Nobody is distracted. Everybody wants to be there, to be present in the way that we talk about that in the theater, with no distractions and really in the moment. And we don't give that to each other in the free world, even when we really love one another, even with our own families. We're so pulled in many directions and so exhausted and so overcommitted that it's really, really hard to be with people in that way. And prisons have this way of kind of stopping time. And that makes it possible for us to be very focused. But I think it also engenders a very deep kind of respect among people there. And I wish desperately that everybody who gets a vote and everybody who sits on a jury could know the incredible humanity of the people I have met in prison. And that's not to say people in prison that there haven't been real crimes committed, that danger and violence are not real. I think I don't want people to misinterpret me as being a kind of Pollyanna who thinks that the world is a really safe place. I realize, and I think we have to honestly deal with violence and rage and a lack of safety in our communities. But I think prison is not a solution that moves us towards public safety. It is exactly the C.S. Lewis moment that you're talking about. Prisons are built to cultivate our hideousness, not to cultivate our glory and our beauty. And nobody knows that better than people in prison, who want to show you, if they have a chance, that they do have beauty.
Yeah. Yes, I received a letter from one of the men when I was in Colorado doing Shakespeare in a men's prison there. He was part of that program, and we, you know, I'm not a volunteer now. My husband's work got us transferred to Texas, but we still stay in touch. So once the volunteer period went by and I could start writing to him, we've written for the last 3 years. And the world you're describing, he wrote to me this way. He said, we all carry a piece of that world. Plant it, nurture it, cultivate the culture you want to see flourish wherever you are. And he's writing to me about what it feels like to have hope start to crack his armor. It's painful, he says. It's painful because he says, I can handle loss. And he's done 10 years in solitary, and he still has 20 or more years to serve on a 40 or so year sentence. He says, I can handle pain, and I can handle loss, and I can handle injury and isolation, whatever. It's hope. It's hope that is the thing that undoes me. And he talks about it as a burning behind his eyes and a pain through his body. And I wondered if you can talk about that, about seeing folks begin to allow themselves to enter into hope, if they would describe it that way, right? Because I know you're all about not inscribing upon people things that we wish might be there, but you're really trying to hear what people are saying for themselves.
Yes, I think it's complicated. And of course, I never want to flatten out the experiences of any prison population. In the United States alone, we have 2.3 million people incarcerated. So the diversity of how people reckon with this terrible experience is, of course, vast and immeasurable, much less when you add in the rest of the world, right? It's just a whole lot of people, and all of those people and their families and everybody to whom they are connected are processing this in their own ways. But I will say that we have to have hope in order to survive. So there are a lot of people in prison who keep hope at a certain level. They keep hope at the level that they need not to get too hopeful and open yourself up to the crushing force of the devastation around you in prison every day. And there are others who sort of open it up for windows and then close it again. One of the hardest things about making theater in prison, in the day-to-day practice of it, is that in my own experience, I take university students in with me, and they just have this incredible energy and joy. You know, they're young people, they're beautiful in so many ways. They have such creativity. They don't really understand what a prison is in a deep, abiding way, as the people who live there, or people like me who've spent years and, you know, grown up in prison visiting rooms. My students are often fresh in a way that doesn't know what to do with the prison, which is delightful. And you see, especially, it looks different in men's and women's prisons. In the men's prison, there's sort of a more obvious lifting of the veil, where people will do things that are very silly and fun and ridiculous as part of our improv engagement. And then you can actually see the physical change in people as they get ready to walk out the door. You can see it when they enter too, in a really beautiful way. And then there's this crushing thing of when it's time to leave the room. It's kind of this reverse physicality, because their hearts are sort of caving in, it looks like, but that results in a bigger body. You're putting on this armor to return to what it looks like to walk the yard. because what it looks like to walk the yard is a very different thing than what it is to have just played these amazing games and shown who you were in the theater workshop. And so I think that I write about hope in the 4th chapter of the book because I see ways in which, particularly in ensemble building in theater, people decide to share a hope, which is a different thing than that individual practice of how I get through the day. And that shared hope is great because then you can turn to other people who know that it exists and it's not just you and you're not crazy. You're really connecting with these other folks who have seen the same thing, done the same thing. And one of the stories that I tell in that chapter is about these women who were, again, doing Shakespeare, they were doing Romeo and Juliet in a prison in Brazil. And they were not using a script. A lot of them were illiterate, and they were being taught the play via improv through scenarios. Like, this scene has these characters and this action, improvise it with your own lines. And when they got to the end, because they were learning it in chronological order, and Romeo and Juliet die, they just revolted. And they said, we've seen enough people die. We live in prison every day. And this is like gang warfare where their families have destroyed them. We don't want to do that anymore. Who the hell is this Shakespeare guy? We're going to take back this play and it's going to belong to us. And it ends in celebration. And that's the hope I want to live in. I want to go to the dance party in the tomb instead of agreeing to let the young folks die.
I love that. I love how that speaks to this question, maybe also, of why Shakespeare now, and the fact that they said, you know what, we're going to rewrite this. So as a springboard, but they weren't going to live there. I think that's very beautiful and powerful. You say the theater can promote free thinking and empathy, but it is not, in fact, liberation. So I just want to hold that there for a moment, alongside with the statements and assertion for people that you record, that doing theater makes me remember that I'm a person or feel that I'm a person, or that it is a way to publicly assert my humanity. So I'm curious about how you hold these things in tension in the book, because I'm thinking in particular of Danny Snyder-Young's book, Theater of Good Intentions, where she in particular focuses on Mead Palladovsky's Story Catchers program, and Mead, who understands what the criticism is, that you're somehow pandering to the system. She understands that as a criticism, but she also knows there's no other way to do the work other than to do the work and to be there and to try to hold that tension or allow it to hold you. And so how do you hold that tension there? And how did you in the book? Those two kind of themes that you really work on trying to weave and separate and
Well, I found myself going to a lot of conferences where people were talking about theater in prison, and also listening to people in prison tell me what the theater was doing for them. And we fall often quite easily into a language that says the theater freed me, the theater liberated me, the theater helped me to escape. They use these words of freedom and liberation and escape a lot. And even when it's coming from the incarcerated people themselves, I find it grating, because I know that they still have to sleep in the prison that night, and that the theater did not actually get them out of prison, that liberation is an actual tangible thing in the context of a prison. It is literal. And if the theater does not actually get you free in that literal sense, then the terminology just kind of scratches at my soul. And that's not to say that I police anybody else's language. I respect everybody's choice, especially the incarcerated folks, to describe it in what way they want. But what I think they're getting at, and that we can't ever lose sight of, is that the theater is this process of awakening emotionally, of allowing yourself to connect to other people, of realizing that you are good. I think that's one of the things that, and I mean, it could mean morally good, which I also think the theater helps us to discover, because we play with the range of what we can be. And if you always were told you were bad and felt like you were bad, and then you realize that you can actually play good, then maybe you can be good too. But I also mean that it helps people to realize that they are talented, that they are leaders, that they are intellectuals, that they are capable of things that nobody ever told them they were capable of. A lot of people describe discovering that in the theater. So that is liberatory, but it is not liberation. And one of the only places where I found that theater actually freed people, I describe in the conclusion of the book, where a man who lives in what they call an open prison in Brazil, where he gets to leave during the day to go to school and to hold a job, but has to sleep in the prison at night, gets more days out of prison. He doesn't have to stay in all the time on the weekend because it becomes a part of his education as a theater student at the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. So being involved in the play literally got him out of prison 2 more days a week than he had been out of prison. So in that case, liberation is real.
Yes.
It is literal. But in most cases, I think we have to live, as all of us who make theater in prison do, with the fact that at the end of the day, we are reduced to those categories of free and not free people. That I get to walk out the door and come home to my beautiful husband and my cat, and those men or women, depending on which prison I've been in that day, or children, because we lock up kids too, in real adult prisons, that those people will persist inside the walls, and some of them for the rest of their lives. A lot of really good people are never coming home in the United States, especially. Some other countries are a little bit more human about it, but I live in Michigan, where we have over 360 juvenile lifers, people who were sentenced to life without parole as children. And now, like 8 or 9 years after the Supreme Court ruling that said that we shouldn't do that to people, a ton of them haven't been brought for a resentencing hearing yet. There are hundreds of people still waiting for a resentencing hearing when they were sentenced to mandatory life without parole as children. And the theater does not fix that. And I really, really want to emphasize that this is not a do-goodery thing where we save the world by making theater. I do think we make the world a concretely better place by engaging in any kind of creative activity that helps us, those of us who don't live in prison and those who do, to come together and understand each other and empathize with one another better. I think that activity is good for all of our souls and humanity, and in a certain sense for all of our metaphysical liberation. But if we can't actually free people, we need to own that too.
Yeah, yeah. I'm picking up on your word awakening, just to go back a little to explore some more of the process of creating the book. And I'm wondering about moments of awakening, wakefulness, clearer seeing, clear-sightedness, that may have happened for you. I know you talked about kind of the structure of the book and the way it sort of changed thematically, or the organization. But in terms of, I guess, what shifted in you? What was awakened in you? How are you different at the end of this process than you were at the beginning of it?
On a very basic level, my life has been filled with so much more beauty and pain and joy all at the same time, that I met extraordinary people, both incarcerated folks and the people who support these programs, who did a lot of work to let me into their programs. I did a whole lot of emailing of people who had no idea who I was or why I was coming or if I was trustworthy, and said, could you please get me into prison, into this highly sensitive and delicate work that you do, to interrupt your process by my very presence? Would you please talk to the prison authorities and get me security clearance and go to a whole lot of trouble for me who you don't know? And it's remarkable the generosity with which I was met, both by the people who made those journeys possible and got me into the prisons and gave me a lot of their time and energy and talked to me about things that are very close to their hearts, and also by the people I met in the prisons. And that included staff. There were some incredibly generous prison staff people who made it possible for me to do this work. So it reminded me of some things that I already knew, but it made them clearer, that prisons are not a monolith, that, but that they are always torturous, that life in prison, no matter how pretty or good the prison is, no matter what the setting, the fact of not being free is in itself torture. The fact of not getting to choose how you spend your day, how you're going to connect with your family and when, even what you're going to wear or eat today, that those are things that, to paraphrase Gloria Anzaldúa, that they grate against the soul and make us bleed. And Gloria Anzaldúa was specifically talking about borders as places where the first and the third worlds grate against each other. But I think prisons are that kind of border in the middle of everybody's country. That the world around the prison has a very distinct border around it that causes a lot of that bleeding. And the clarity that comes with knowing that we are all really wrong, that we are all really wrong to have put all of these people in prison. I was already pretty clear about that as the child of an incarcerated person who saw a lot of other people in this journey, but to get to see it worldwide and to realize that it's not like we need to aspire to the better system somewhere else, but just that this is really a practice against humanity. That became very clear for me.
You talk about it as the practice, well, it's a socially constructed practice, prisons, right? Which suggests it can be deconstructed. Just ask the big question, because I'm so glad we get the chance to talk, and I want to know your thoughts on what does that look like, if not prison, what?
Well, here's the thing. The people at Critical Resistance have been saying this forever. Critical Resistance is an incredible prison abolition group of whom Angela Davis is the most famous member, but there are a lot of other good, hardworking people who've been involved alongside Angela in that project for years. What they have been trying to teach all of us for a long time is that abolition is about presence more than it's about absence. So it's not so much about tearing down the prison as it is shoring up all of these other social systems and supports that make prisons not necessary, that make police not necessary. So we do have to contend with the fact that crime and violence are real, but we have to make honest investments in public safety. For my money, prisons and police make us less safe because they introduce more violence. We sort of take it for granted culturally in the United States, and I think in many people's countries, that when you go to prison, you are going to be subject to the distinct possibility of rape, that you are going to be subject to violence that could come from many different places, that you will be degraded, that you will be stripped, that your body will be probed. We accept that for some reason when we wouldn't accept it in any other context. We also can even joke about people being raped in prison when I don't know that it's acceptable in 2020 to joke about rape in any other context. That's not okay. It's not okay in prison. It's real. And I think what we actually need is schools that serve everybody, an investment that we all make in public education, rather than talking about education as something that you pay for from K through 12 up through graduate school. I think we should make a public social investment in everybody's education, and that things like levying taxes to be specific to the community where those taxes come from, in repairing the roads and fixing the schools and whatever it is that that community needs to be healthy, doesn't make sense, because the poor people will always be at a severe disadvantage. So as we think about a different kind of world, we need some different version of the New Deal that takes care of all of us, that gives people meaningful work to do, that doesn't just say, if you come out of prison, really all you're good for is to be a janitor or to do hard labor. That people in prison need a range of options, just like all the rest of us, to figure out where you shine and what you might do well. We need wage equality. We need protections for workers. We need public health care for everybody. And I realize that these are tall orders and that people think I'm crazy when I talk about systemic change on that kind of a level. But honestly, all of that would be such a better investment than the investment we keep making in prisons, because we keep being afraid. And our public safety would come in a much greater way if we invested proactively instead of reactively.
Sure.
That's what abolition looks like for me.
Sure. And what's fun and fascinating and cool is that when you talked about it being presence rather than absence, is that how you said at the beginning? Nick Facette, who I just spoke with previously, described it in the same way too. Do you guys know each other?
We do. Nick is delightful.
Okay, fun, good. It's good being part of a network where people know each other and where more people are welcomed into those relationships and that knowing. I think that's really important. Maybe never be a group that closes the borders, because we're only be as rich, right, as many people as we welcome into this conversation. At the end of the first 2 chapters, you call for prison administrators to open the gates and let outsiders interact with the incarcerated. And as a side piece, in one of your previous parts, you just simply talk about encouraging staff to mentor incarcerated people and invest in their well-being. So you're talking about the power that administrators have to open and close, right? To allow or not allow, and it is a tremendous, palpable, real power. So what have you observed in the programs that you visited around the world? You know, what's going on with those people, those systems? I mean, in the end, each prison is run by individuals who have a particular idea about what should be going on there. And what's our role as prison theater practitioners, as writers, thinkers, speakers, in trying to connect more deeply and trying to communicate more clearly? Or is there nothing we do that makes that different? What helps those doors to open from the administrator's point of view?
I think trust is where it all comes in. And in this sense, it's very difficult, because in my personal experience as a prison theater or a prison arts program administrator, the administrations at prisons change quite a lot. Some of it is with a political shift in your particular nation or locale. Some of it is that people often aren't very happy working in prisons, and so the turnover can be very high. I know it is in the state of Michigan. And whenever you lose somebody who you were working with, whether you got along with that person or not, you're starting from scratch in a lot of ways with building relationships. And so the question of how much a given program in a prison can do, whether it's an arts program or any other kind, has a lot to do with what the people in power say is acceptable in that prison. And even within the same state, the Prison Creative Arts Project that I work with works with all 27 adult correctional facilities in Michigan. One of those is federal. All of the others belong to the Michigan Department of Corrections. And in each place, the procedures and what's allowable and what is the culture of that place is so different that we have a lot to manage, a lot to navigate in each place. And often when directives come from the central administration of the entire prison system, they're interpreted differently at the different facilities. So much of it has to do with relationship building. I hope that prison administrators can also see that programs make prisons safer, that having people actively engaged in something positive and invested in what really matters to them makes everybody in the prison safer. Because if you feel like it doesn't matter whether you live or die, then it doesn't matter whether you live or die, and it doesn't matter whether the person next to you lives or dies. So to get rid of that fatalism, you have to invest in all the people in the prison. So the places where the work is done the most fully and fruitfully actually let the staff get involved in the programming as well, which is rare in the United States.
And where did you see that, Ashley? Where did you see, because that really intrigues me, that staff involvement. Where did you see that?
Citizens Theatre in Glasgow, Scotland, actually had a production of West Side Story where one of the guards played Officer Krupke, which is just one of my favorite images. I didn't get to see that, but to imagine all these people with Scottish accents doing West Side Story and the guard playing Officer Krupke, I just think that's a beautiful image. But there are programs in other parts of the world, and I have found anecdotally in my own experience that there are certain staff members who will get involved in things like improv games as long as they know that nobody else is watching. But if another staff person walks by, then they have to assume the role of staff again, when what they really wanted to do was to be a part of that community that forms in the theater.
Yeah, I think one of the things that tugged at my heart and mind in my criminology studies at Cambridge was starting to read some of the good, you know, because I think as I talked about with Nick, researchers have a lot more access to prisons in England, so there's more ethnographic study done. And some work has started to be produced in the last 10 or so years on staff and experience of staff in prisons, and alongside, you know, work on the prisoner experience. And my heart goes out to staff in prisons, especially the ones who actually believe that humanity is real and true and beautiful in prisons, and who are the person you're talking about, right? Who's torn between the roles that they feel they have to play, or maybe is transitioning in their heart and mind and soul about trying to understand what's going on there. And so, I don't know, but I feel like part of what we're doing is not trying to go in antagonistically towards staff. And, you know, it's so tricky because you've got to navigate that space. And yet at the same time, until there's a feeling of belongingness somehow between people, as tricky as that is and as complicated as that is in a prison. You talk about a warden sitting down in a group. Was it in Michigan?
Yes, it was with Shakespeare Behind Bars.
I thought that was fascinating. And I wondered if you've seen that repeated anywhere else. And I loved how you described the men in the group as just going on as if that was just nothing unusual.
I mean, that Mary Burgess, that warden, is an extraordinary woman. She's retired now, but she had a way of making the men that I saw her interact with, I can't speak for all the men in the prisons that she governed, she had a way of making them feel seen and appreciated and like she was invested in their well-being. And she was definitely very invested in the Shakespeare Behind Bars program and in the Prison Creative Arts Project. She wanted the men who were living in the prison that she governed, or two prisons at the same time, actually, when I knew her as a warden. She was invested in them having chances to grow and become better people. And I think that's a different thing than rehabilitation. Rehabilitation sort of assumes that there was a habilitation to go back to. And a lot of people I've met in prison came from lives that had such chaos that they never knew peace. And they often didn't have the kind of moral compass that they came to develop as adults because they never saw it in their childhood. So, and then there are other people in prison who really did something because they were in a horrible situation, but they weren't people who made a habit of crime and therefore didn't need to be rehabilitated. They needed not to be in a terrible situation that caused whatever the crime was. So I have seen some really good wardens be very supportive. George Lombardi, who was the head of the entire Missouri Department of Corrections, was hugely supportive during his tenure of the Prison Performing Arts program in St. Louis, and actually stood up at the end of a production of Hip Hop Hamlet to say to the audience that you need to give money to prison performing arts. I've never seen that done before. That was a beautiful thing to witness. But yes, I think that when people pay close attention to what the theater actually accomplishes, everybody should make an investment in it. But that said, I don't know that you can say that theater serves the goals of the prison. It does make prisons safer, but the goal of the prison is not necessarily to be safe. So prisons are inherently full of contradiction.
Yes, absolutely full of contradiction. Would you like to pick one of these final readings? Because I'd love to kind of begin to wrap it up on your words from your book. On my notes. Oh, I have one from, I can't find it.
There was a passage from chapter 4 about hope that I could read if that sounds good to you.
Correct.
And in this passage, I'm referring to the work of somebody's daughter theater company in Melbourne, Australia, and Teatro na Prisão, which is based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I had been to see women doing performances in both places. Some intangible light shone out of the women that I met in these prisons in Australia and Brazil. Their performances served not just to buoy them through another day, but also to draw audience members like me into their hope. Like Jill Dolan, they reminded all of us present that we can and should dream of a better life for ourselves and everyone else, especially when we are in the theater. I still want to know if a better life awaits them, if they could be my neighbors and bring their gifts into the wider world. They have something to offer that makes the world more beautiful, richer, more interesting. A man named Curtis Dawkins wrote an exquisite collection of short stories called The Gray Bar Hotel while serving life in a Michigan prison. One of his characters describes another incarcerated man and captures precisely what drew me in as I watched the women in both of these prison theater companies. Dawkins writes, "He had a kind of knowledge no one really wants to come by honestly because it involves unimaginable loss. He had literally been to hell and back, and part of him knew it. Someone like that, someone who had layers burned away to reveal something essential, is worth knowing."
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll give Curtis Dawkins the last word for today. He's still serving time in a Michigan prison and is a beautiful soul.
That is beautiful. Because we have just a couple minutes, I want to ask you what's next for you. You've come through this massive journey and come to the end of it, and I imagine a new one is starting. In just the couple minutes that we have left, if you can just give us a clue of where you're at, kind of with what you're thinking. And then, yes, what do we want to pose as some food for thought, maybe for our question and answer session that we'll follow up with. So.
Yeah, in terms of what's next, I kind of thought I knew, and then the global pandemic hit and the crisis in prisons shifted in a lot of ways. And I kind of feel like maybe what's next for me is writing a new play, but I don't know what it is yet. I don't know what it looks like, but I'm feeling a call to creative writing, I think, instead of academic writing at this point in my life. Mm-hmm. And what I hope people will continue to think through and think about, again, something that this group, the Shakespeare in Prisons Network, has already been thinking about very seriously, is how do we continue to support people that we can no longer go to visit in person in prison. We've pivoted at the Prison Creative Arts Project to do a lot of work via correspondence programming, and it offers different challenges and different rewards. And I'm wondering how the things that we learn now in this time of separation can continue to serve us when we go back inside in person. I very much hope that day is coming sooner rather than later. But how do we listen? How do we honor those lives? How do we help make these folks visible to ourselves and to the rest of the world in a time when I think the world really needs their voices?
Thank you. That is a clarion call and call and response. And thank you for issuing both the call and the response and a new call. And thank you for your time. Yeah.
I'm honored to get to talk about all of this with you today. And I thank you for reading my book so thoughtfully.
Thank you for writing it so lovingly and so well. And I look forward to seeing what the next chapters of life and writing hold for you.
Yeah. Thank you.